You've heard of playing over changes. Josh Smith also refers to this as playing through changes. Some people call this chord chasing. The idea is pretty simple. All these phrases point to one technique and one idea, which is basically while you're playing as a soloist, you or I, you're outlining the harmony underneath you somehow, right? The notes you're choosing connect directly to the harmony underneath you. Target notes, that idea of target notes, is basically the primary tool here. So target notes suggest that you're using notes, you're landing on notes, or using notes that are directly connected to the chords that are being played underneath you, as at any moment. However, when chord progressions change keys, there are other techniques and other ideas that also provide very, very useful results. Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name's Chris. Today you will learn about scale shifting. I'm going to explain what scale shifting is, why would we even need to do it, and I'm going to show you how to play it on the instrument, how to find it and manipulate it, and then most importantly, how to hear what's going on. As I mentioned at the top, target notes are sort of the primary tool in playing over changes, right? No matter what happens, if you're playing a chord and you target a note inside the chord, it's going to work, right? So A minor, for example. If I play an A, a C, or an E, when I play my solo, it's going to be inside, right? I'm going to be playing exactly what is required. In other words, I'm suggesting the harmony underneath me. However, when the key changes, if we're playing a chord progression that features a key change, something else is going on there, which is where this scale shifting idea comes from. So again, target notes all about playing the notes that are in the chord. However, when the key changes, let's just talk about key changes for a second, the scale is changing as well. So a key is made up of a scale. So this is the A major scale. Those 7 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, outline the key of A. All the chords in the key of A are built from those 7 notes. If you play, and no matter where you play them, you're in the key of A. If you play any other notes besides that, those 7, you're outside of the key. And if you play any chords that are not built from those notes, you're outside of the key. This is a key change. And as such, key changes are scale changes. So what we're going to be looking at today is scale shifting, meaning when we encounter a key change, finding out what scale has changed and how that's different from target notes. Let me zoom in and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, let's get to shifting scales. As I explained, key changes are really scale changes, right? Scales produced keys, right? You harvest the notes of a scale into chords. You have chords from that key. All of that goes back to scales. So what we're going to do here is look at the scales that shift over a chord progression with some key changes in it. The chord progression we're going to use today is a blues progression in the key of A. These are all dominant chords, A7, D7, and E7. So A7 is the first chord, then we have D7 and E7. These are all dominant 7th chords. Dominant chord, here's the A7 arpeggio. It's built from the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the flat 7. So this is a dominant 7, A dominant 7 arpeggio. Root 3, 5, flat 7, root 3, 5, flat 7, root. That structure, that dominant chord structure, root 3, 5, flat 7, is built from the 5th degree of the major scale. Now, that gets into modes and stuff like that, but don't worry about it. We're going to cut to the chase here in a second. But what that suggests is that each one of these chords is built from the 5th degree of a different scale. They're all dominant chords. That means they all come from different scales because the dominant chord is created from the 5th degree of a major scale. So these are all different dominant chords, which means they all come from different scales. So let's find out what those are. And again, you don't have to track too much of this. I'm going to do all the hard work right now for you. A7 is the 5th of D. So here's how that works. D, E, F, G, A. A is the 5th of D. So this A7 comes from the D major scale. just going to go through these quickly. The D chord comes from the G major scale. G, A, B, C, D is the fifth of G. So this D7 chord comes from the G major scale. The E7 chord comes from the A major scale. A, B, C, D, E. E is the fifth degree of the A major scale. So this E7 chord comes from the A major scale. Now, this is all a lot of numbers and scales and cross-referencing. This is the fifth of that. It's confusing, but it's objective truth. I'm not adding all this information in to confuse anyone. I'm just explaining what you're actually hearing in theoretical terms. And even though the blues progression doesn't sound strange to us, these chord progressions, this chord progression specifically, and these key changes are ubiquitous. We hear them and we accept them, and that's what they are. We're just explaining what they are here. So, a lot going on here. What I'd like to do now is reduce our noise factor and try to get the cognitive load down way, way, way low. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at the D and the G strings in the fourth position. So index finger on the fourth fret on the D and G string only. And I'm going to use this position to outline these different scales. So, first scale for the A7 is a D major scale. So I'm going to play a D major scale, and we're just going to map the notes on that D and G string from that scale. Here's the D major scale. Those are the notes on the D and the G string from that D major scale. And it outlines A7. The next chord in the chord progression is D7. That takes the G major scale. Here's what those notes look like on that same set of strings. I'm going to play the whole scale. Here it comes. Notice there's one note difference. Here's the D major scale on those strings. Here's the G major scale on those strings. One note difference. For the E7, we're going to use the A major scale. Here it comes. So I've just played the corresponding scales for each one of these chords, and I'm just going to use that D and G string to watch the scale change. So this is the first one. That's the D major scale, fits over the A7. For the D7, we go to this scale. And for the E7, we use the A major scale. So really quickly, here's what that looks like. On that first scale for the A7, we're using the D major scale, and that is 4, 5, 7, 4, 6, 7 on the D and G string. For the D7 chord, we're switching to G major, and that's 4, 5, 7 on the D and 4, 5, 7 on the G. And for the E7 chord, we're switching to the A major scale, which is 4, 6, 7, 4, 6, 7. So I'm just going to play the chord progression and just play these scales so you can hear the difference. So you can hear those chords going by because I'm playing the scale source, the source scale for each one of the chords. So ultimately, this is the sort of source scale for each one of these chords. This is the source material, the raw material that these chords come from. Now, when you're playing through the chord progression, what you want to start doing after you just get the basic shapes down is start targeting those notes that are changing. So from the A7 chord, this is what I would play over the A7 chord, to the D7 chord. There's only one note that changes, right? That's over the A7. That's over the D7. It's this note that changes. So when that chord change comes, I'm going to target that exact part of the scale. So here's a lick that might work during that change. Right? Here's the A chord. Now I'm changing that note on the G string. Right? Here's the chords. I'm using the scale tone moving around, right? So same thing from the E to the D. That change might sound like this. So, interesting. We're using the scale tones, not so much the chord tones, right? The chord tones are really going to get a little pedantic after a while. Just playing the roots, thirds, fives, flat sevens just starts to sound a little too much, right? These scale tones are a little more sophisticated, a little more subtle, and they move through the progression a little bit more subtly. It's a little more sort of like, it's a smoother sound because you're drawing from a wider library of notes. Okay, there's scale shifting. Quite interesting. Those target notes, right? The sweet spots of the chords, the root, the third, the fifth, maybe the seventh, right? Those are all great, and they're going to work no matter what happens, even through key changes. But when that scale changes, you've got a wider palette of notes now. It's not just the root, the third, or the fifth of the chord. It's the entire scale that the key is generated from. Now you've got a much more subtle and sophisticated way of saying things that are a little less sort of hammering it home, like root 3, 5, root 3, 5. When you're just playing root 3, 5, you know, it gets a little pedantic, right? Instead of there's a little bit more movement in the scale because it's using notes that aren't necessarily in the chord, but they are in the key. Okay, I hope this helps. I hope this is interesting for you. I've tabbed it all out, and that's on Patreon. That you can find that in the link below. So head on over there if you want the tabs. If you enjoy this channel and what I do resonates with you and you'd like to show your support, Patreon's a great place to do it. I've also got a donate button down there in the description. And if you do choose to support the channel, I thank you in advance. Okay, scale shifting, give it a try. Over that blues progression, you have 3 different scales that will work. Experiment with this. See what it sounds like to use that more subtle and sophisticated palette over these changes. See if you like it. See if it makes sense for you. And don't stop until you really get it and you really can hear it and see it. All right, I hope this is helpful. I hope you enjoy this, and I will see you next time.